hear me, I hope? I'm sure you can. Good. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to everyone who's come, students, obviously, members of staff, special guests. We're very pleased to have you here for this annual talk, let's call it, with Sir Richard Eyre, who's president of Rose Bruford College. I'll introduce and say a bit more about him in a second, but we're very pleased too to have the Mayor of Bexley with us tonight. Thank you, sir, for coming. And a number of our governors are here, Chair of Governors, and other special guests from as far away as Edinburgh. Richard DeMarco is here, and I'm sure he has a question for us after. So, and we want to hear questions from all of you. So the ground rules tonight really are quite simple. Richard and I will speak for about 40 minutes, and largely about his current book, which is called What Do I Know? People, Politics, and the Arts. So we're going to talk a bit about that triptych of people, politics, and the arts. And I think Sir Richard will probably also read some sections from the book. I actually came to know you many years ago when I was a producer at the BBC, and you had published, I think it was probably your first major book, which was a book of memoirs called Utopia and Other Places. And we got in touch with you and to see if we could do it as a book at bedtime for Radio 4, and you said yes. And we got you out of, I'm sure, a very busy rehearsal schedule at the National Theatre and got you up to probably Maida Vale or someplace, and we did a whole day of recording, and it was terrific and thrilling, and it was a kind of moment when you sort of established yourself, I think, in the public eye as a writer, as more than just a director, as more as someone who ran the National Theatre, more of an arts personality, but someone who can actually put pen together and move people with words. The writing thing has been a continuous thing over many, many years, though, hasn't it?
It's been a continuous thing since I wrote that book. And the reason I wrote that book, which I wrote 20 plus years ago, was because a friend of mine called Liz Calder, who was the person who started Bloomsbury Publishing, famous, if for nothing else, for the fact they published Harry Potter when nobody else would publish Harry Potter. Liz came to me, I've known her for a few years, and she said, I'd read an article you wrote for the Evening Standard, and you can write, and will you write a book? And I was absolutely capsized by it. I had no idea. I'd never thought I would write a book. And so I found myself saying, yes, sir, yes, of course I will. And I did. And in fact, my parents had both died. So the thing I most wanted to write about was family history, and have a posthumous conversation, have the conversation with both my parents that I'd never been able to have in their lifetime. So that's really how I became a writer. And it's quite a serious character flaw that I've never done anything in my life that hasn't been at somebody else's suggestion. I became a director because somebody said, you know, you should direct. I became an actor before I was a director because somebody said, oh, you should act. And I've just, it's lamentable, but there it is, that I'm here because you said, will you become president of Rose Bruford too?
And you did that reading because I asked you if you'd do that reading.
It's absolutely true.
Yeah.
And it was very refreshing for me to be directed after spending many, many years being a director and telling actors how to improve what they were already doing. To find myself on the receiving end of that was quite chastening and rather useful. and it made me realize how much you want, as a performer, how you want feedback, how you want to be told something, how you can do something better, how you can make better sense, even of something that I'd written myself.
Yeah. Well, the first part of this book, too, it's a good introduction because it's about people. And people are a constant throughout the book, and you use encounters and have written very well in other books. You did a Talking Theater, for instance. There's a whole book of interviews with theater personality. And before that, the book that came out was your memoir and diary of the National Theater called National Service, which again is all about people. And the people that you write about are not just actors and directors prominently, but also playwrights, and not just British playwrights, but lovely piece about Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams, but also about personalities. Mary Soames, the daughter of Winston Churchill, who is your chair at the National Theatre. Tell us about people. What is it that fascinates you about them? Is it just
well, I guess I'm just fascinated by people. I mean, I'm, as they say, or maybe they don't say mercifully in this country, I'm in the people business. That's what interests me. That's why I'm interested in drama, in theatre, because it's the one art form that absolutely, to which people are indispensable. You can't make abstract theatre. There's always a person, and there's always people in the audience, and that's the nature of the medium. So I guess I'm drawn to the medium because that's what it is. It's people, and for me, there's no question, as sort of a bit of self-analysis, that I realized when I was writing this first book for Liz Calder, that for me it's surrogate family. I came from to put it mildly, dysfunctional family. And it's always been, the theatre's been vicarious family and a surrogate. And I love the part of being part of the whole, and theatre itself, which is, making a series, a collection of individuals into a whole, into a community, into a little world, and that fascinates me.
You write about your family. You came from, you said you were the first to go to university, that you came from a military family predominantly.
Yes, I might read a bit about,
okay.
Well, this was a few years ago. I started to write a lot of journalism. I used to write a column for The Guardian, and then I had a friend who became editor of the Sunday Telegraph, and she said, do you want to do an interview? I said, yes, please. Who do you want to interview? And I thought, actually, I don't want to interview anybody from my world, the world of entertainment, showbiz. I said, I want to interview General Sir Mike Jackson. And General Sir Mike Jackson was at that time Chief of Staff. He was the head of the armed forces. And so I'll just start. To borrow from Neil Kinnock, I was the first heir in 1,000 generations to get to university. In his case, this had everything to do with enlightened educational policies and the introduction of free tuition, o tempora, o mores. In my case, you joined the army or navy because it's what you did. My father and maternal grandfather were naval officers, my paternal one a major, his father a colonel, and so on for receding generations. I was born during a war. I loved the romance, the nobility, the extremity, and the secrecy of war, a test of character and a proof of life. Then with the end of the British Empire, Suez, and the end of civilization, the bomb, and the end of conscription, I renounced war's allure and became part of the first generation in our century who were not called upon to fight a war for their country, and part of a substantial minority who recoiled from our nation's involvement in war. In the world that I grew up in, it wasn't uncommon to join the army because you couldn't do anything else. For much the same reasons, I became an actor. A profession which had this at least in common with soldiering. I was required to dress up for work, was often involved in pointless routines, was subject to confused or conflicting orders, had to engender patience in the face of waiting tedium, and endure frequent degradation with amused stoicism. At this point, the analogy breaks down into preposterous and insulting bathos. The job of soldiers is to make war, not to pretend to. Soldiers have to be prepared to kill and be killed on the instructions of elected politicians who act on our behalf. I'm fascinated by the profession of soldiering, the strutting neatness, cleanness, pomp and order of the soldier's life in peacetime, set against the blood that gets shed in foreign fields far from home, and the seductive panoply of uniforms, pipes, drums, marching, medals, men amongst men, and the promise of adventure set against its savage corollary, hidden from the recruit, of breaking the ultimate taboo against killing your fellow man. This fascination has led me from Shakespeare's protagonists to Tumbledown, a film I made about the Falklands War in 1987, and now to the Ministry of Defence to interview the man who runs the British Army, General Sir Mike Jackson.
Oh, lovely, great, fantastic. Yeah.
Who was, as you might have seen him on television, man with big ears, bald head, looked brilliant in uniform. And he talks like that.
But getting back into your world then, sounds a bit like Harold Pinter.
That's something in common.
Yeah,
Imperious.
Yeah.
Yes.
You write well about playwrights, and you clearly have worked with a lot of playwrights at the National Theatre. Which are the ones who stand out?
Well, I wrote in this book about a friend of mine, John Mortimer, who was playwright, wit, raconteur, novelist, sort of very successful barrister and national treasure. And I was immensely flattered and somewhat overawed by being asked, when John died at the age of 85, I was asked if I would give the eulogy at his funeral, which was in the little church in the village where he'd grown up. And he'd been born in the house that he lived in for 85 years, and he was buried in the churchyard of the local church. And I was asked to give this eulogy. And I went to the lectern and looked up, and there was just about every major figure, literary figure in the country, sitting there in the church, all thinking, why wasn't I asked to do this? Anyway, this is how I started. It was said by another national treasure, Alan Bennett, that Philip Larking's Waiting Nightmare was of thousands of school children massed in the Albert Hall, chanting in unison, "They fuck you up, your mum and dad." Alan's gloss on this was that if your parents didn't fuck you up and you wanted to become a writer, then they'd have fucked you up good and proper. The formula worked in John's case. His father diverted him from being a writer to becoming a barrister and unintentionally left him a great legacy. The law became his subject. The other indispensable legacy, a paradoxical one, was that while his father passed on a love of poetry, he withheld his own love. John didn't mimic this deficiency. In all his memoirs, he showed an undiminished love of his father and of his own children, and it's a remarkable homage to his father that John went out of this world in the same house that he was brought up in. And I'll just cut to the end of the eulogy. John once told me that he'd met the great French actor Jean Marais. Marais told John that he'd said to Cocteau, "I want to do three things in a play. I want to be silent in the first act, I want to cry with joy in the second act, and I want to come down a long staircase in the third." Cocteau actually wrote a play for him that fitted the prescription. John's prescription might have been this: I want to do three things in my life. In the first act, I want to be very gifted and earn the admiration of many. In the second act, I want to enjoy the company of my family and friends and of beautiful and intelligent women. In the third act, I want to ascend a long staircase to heaven through clouds of glory accompanied by choirs of angels. Or, as John Bunyan put it, when the day that he must go hence was come, many accompanied him to the riverside, into which, as he went, he said, "Death, where is thy sting?" And as he went down deeper, he said, "Grave, where is thy victory?" So he passed over, and all the trumpets sounded for him on the other side.
Oh, lovely. Thanks. That's really amazing. And that was, he must have helped you quite a bit at the National Theatre.
Well, John, anecdotally, yes. I mean, he tipped me off about who to be wary of on the board of the National Theatre. And he was just a good friend who was the most wonderful company. And you always look forward to spending time with John. He was, I don't know a better raconteur, and he would just, like the best raconteurs, he'd just make his own time, and his timing was perfect. And he'd talk in this rather hesitant voice, and then these wonderful exotic tales, mostly about the law, would just cascade out of him.
Yeah. And let's get on to some of the actors you've worked with, directed. Judy Dench, for instance.
Yeah.
You've worked with her a lot, and a lot of
Judy Dench
content.
I've known since the 60s. Judy Dench is curiously tied into me becoming a director, because when I was an actor, I was in a show at the Leicester Phoenix Theatre. This was in the 60s. And I was very, very fed up. And I persuaded some actors who were in the company to let me direct them in a show which was on a Sunday night, and canvassed for people to come to this Sunday night performance. John Neville, who was a brilliant actor, was running the Nottingham Playhouse at the time. He was also walking out with Judy Dench. And so on the Sunday night, John appeared at the Phoenix Theatre, Leicester, with Judy. And that's when I first met Judy. And also the play was a big success, the production, the Sunday night production. And afterwards, I got 2 job offers. One was from John Neville, and one was from the guy who was then running the Phoenix Theatre, Leicester. So Judy has always been the sort of my guardian angel. And I saw it on Sunday. We had this, we were at a fundraiser for this is my chat, a fundraiser for the Tricycle Theatre. And they were showing my film Iris, which I did with Judy and Jim Broadbent. And Judy and Jim and I did a Q&A after the film. And I hadn't seen the film for 14 years. It came out about 2000, 2001. And I'd just forgotten, if I needed reminding, what a just genius Judy is. And I have written in here about Judy. It's quite a long piece, but I might read a small, I try and describe Judy's, what Judy's acting is. And there's just a bit, when I was editing Iris, the editor was reluctant to cut the beginning of one take. He'd say, "Look at this," and he'd show me a shot of Judy in which you'd see her laughing. She'd been telling a joke. And then you could hear my voice saying, "Action." And within 4 frames, which is 1/6 of a second, there was a woman in the later stages of decay from Alzheimer's disease, or more to the point, there wasn't a woman. There was an absence of woman, totally vanished behind the eyes. And it was like watching a musician rehearse. Bar 34, says the conductor, gives the downbeat, and the soloist and orchestra pick up on the first note of the bar. No shuffling, no prevarication, pitch and tempo perfect. I think Judy is a genius, and I know exactly how she would react if I said so to her face. "Oh, Rich," she'd say, and shrug like a cat arching its back. And then she'd laugh. That word genius is a rather debased currency. We tend to sprinkle it about like Italian waiters with peppermills. But I think it's accurate to call Judy a genius because she's one of those people like Oscar Peterson or Yehudi Menuhin or Cary Grant who appear to do what they do brilliantly as if it cost them nothing, as if it was effortless. Judy acts like Matisse draws, never taking his hand from the page.
Amazing. She's a giggler, isn't she?
She is a giggler, yeah. She is a giggler. She's just fantastic fun. She's a great companion, and she has an extraordinary eye for because she doesn't research parts. She sort of takes them on by osmosis, and without you being aware of it, she's watching people and watching their mannerisms, and she has an extraordinary empathy with, and she's the ultimate in making no judgment about people, which is probably why I think she's by far and away the best Lady Macbeth of the last 50 years. She was absolutely brilliant and compelling because she just she got inside through sheer empathy into that, very unhappy woman's mind.
Talking about Lady Macbeth, unhappy women, and so forth, your time at the National Theatre, and even before, your time really as a professional running other theatres, not just at the National, but in Nottingham, also in Edinburgh, really traversed a period of Conservative governments, New Labour governments, now coalition governments. And of course, one of the people you would have had to encounter at some stage along the way was Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, actually, I left a few months after the great, what seems now extraordinary, 1997, the May election of 97, when, embarrassingly, though I wasn't among them, people celebrated as if it was the fall of Ceausescu, and in came the new dawn of New Labour. It seems so quaint now that just the appetite for hope and regeneration. So I ran the National Theatre for 10 years during a Tory government, and I did write about. I was asked by the Evening Standard to write a piece about Margaret Thatcher. And so I wrote the piece, and then she was quite seriously ill, and then she got better. Anyway, they said, well, we can't run the piece, obviously. But then, when she did die, they did run the piece.
Did you change anything in the piece?
And actually, I didn't change anything. And I'll read the beginning and the end. It was a strangely wondrous evening yesterday, leaving so much to think about. I still find myself rather disturbed by it. But if they can do that without any ideals, then if we apply the same perfection and creativeness to our message, we should be able to provide quite good historic material for an opera called Margaret in 30 years' time. Well, over 30 years has passed since Margaret Thatcher wrote this to her speechwriter, the playwright Ronald Miller, after he'd taken her to see Evita. Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice were to turn their hands to composing Margaret, despite good historical material, they would be up against it. The central character would lack sympathy, the recitative would be repetitive, and the libretto would be unrewarding. Essential songs would include I Just Owe Almost Everything to My Own Father, Where There Is Discord, May We Bring Harmony, We Can Do Business Together, Rejoice, Rejoice, The Bowling's Going to Get Hit All Round the Ground, That Is My Style, No, 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 There Is No Such Thing as Society, I Shall Let My Name Go Forward, and the tearful finale, Thank you very much, goodbye. The arc of its action would rise to vainglorious cavalcade, then decline to tragic farce. Its epigraph could be supplied by Enoch Powell, all political lives, unless they are cut off in midstream at a happy juncture, end in failure. And this is how I end talking about there's no such thing as society, has turned out to be a self-fulfilling proposition. The residue of that statement is an attitude that encourages us to regard human beings as units to be measured, counted, assessed, and disposed of if they have no immediate economic worth. That any social activity that cannot be shown to have a structure or a purpose that imitates the business of making money is imbued with self-doubt and insecurity, and that the very society whose existence she denied, those people who believe that we do things better together than we do alone, is corroded by the reductive logic of market economics. Would reform of organisations like the NHS and the BBC have occurred without Thatcher's zealotry? Would the Murdochization of the media have occurred without her vigorous reciprocal encouragement? Was the credit collapse the last sigh of her legacy? Was she a charismatic revolutionary? Did she change the syntax of Britain's politics? Or was she the Wizard of Oz, a confection of bombast and rhetorical flourishes? During the height of her power, dreams of Margaret Thatcher were as common as dreams about the Queen. Well, Alan Clark was not enjoying lubricious fantasies about her. She used to appear in his dreams as his mother. When I was director of the National Theatre, I dreamt that I had a meeting with her, during which I spoke without drawing breath to convince her that the arts were not a waste of time and money. My dream never came true, but then neither did hers. According to friends, in her declining years, she dreamed she was still Prime Minister.
So you never met her?
I didn't. I knew most of her cabinet.
Did she come to the theatre?
No. Lord, no, not at all. I think the occasion when Ronald Miller took her to see Evita was one of the very, very few times she ever went to the theatre. No, she thought it was a waste of time. I think she found it very hard to sit for a couple of hours and not hear the sound of her own voice.
What about other politicians and their relationship to the arts, and how the arts were treated over that long period when you were running theatre?
I think the relationship of politicians to the arts has been pretty consistent. I simply don't think that politicians don't have time for the arts, certainly not nowadays when politics is fully professionalized and politics is a profession, whereas it used to be the sort of domain of the enthusiastic amateur. I mean, you were expected to have a kind of cultural life. I mean, Macmillan, when he was Prime Minister, used to go off for the weekend and read novels. And, even there were Tories, the sort of latter-day Tories, during my time, my 10 years at the National Theatre, I knew 12, I think, arts ministers, which is extraordinary, really. And much the nicest was a man called Peter Brooke, whose father was Henry Brooke, who was a notoriously harsh flogger of a Home Secretary. And his son was an absolutely delightful man who was fascinated by the arts and went to the theatre a lot, read a lot of books, knew a lot about painting, and was sort of perfectly cast in that part. And since then, it seemed time after time that the casting of the person who runs the DCMS is sort of bizarrely, perversely, and almost deliberately chosen to be somebody who has no feeling for the arts and can't act as an advocate, which is in any other sphere bewildering. You know, you don't appoint somebody to be Minister of Transport who actually abhors the whole idea of travel. It's very, very weird, and it is a way of demonstrating that, you know, that I think my contention that because the virtue of the arts can't be quantified, although I'm always depressed when they are quantified and people say, well, it's a good investment and, you know, you get back more than you invest, which seems, you know, it's not a negligible point, but it's not the point to make about the arts. But I wrote a bit about the arts in a piece called Cultural Apartheid, when I was writing about what I described in order to provoke a reaction of apartheid in this country, which is the distinction between those who grow up thinking that the arts are part of their lives and those who are completely disenfranchised. And I've said to every minister that I've ever met in the arts that there is no point providing money, helping the arts, unless you're prepared to accept the corollary of it, which is that you must induce the education department to include the arts as part of the education, so that the tomorrow's audience, tomorrow's gallery goers and museum goers and film goers are actually educated. I mean, that seems, but you can't get a meeting between the education department and the DCMS. And the last person I spoke to about this was a man called Michael Gove. And this was before the last election. And he said, of course.
Yeah.
And there was a man called Jeremy Hunt, who was then, who started off at the DCMS. And they both said, of course we accept that. You know, then nothing happened. So one of the difficulties, of course, is arguing for art. Is what do you mean by it? You know, what is art? And I did attempt to describe what I describe here as a personal catechism of what art is. Art, good or bad, high or low, must have form. It must have shape. It's a way of knowing the world, of giving form and meaning to things that seem formless. A work of art has to have ambition beyond wanting to please the audience or appease fashion, a desire to examine the world, people or nature or society, and make it look or sound or seem new. A work of art should introduce something to the world that didn't exist before. Art is everything that politics isn't. Politics generalizes about people, art particularizes. Art is about the I in life, not about the we, about private life rather than public life. Nevertheless, a public life that doesn't acknowledge the private is a life not worth having. There has to be complexity about art, but that's not the same as obscurity. There must be mystery, a sense of unknowability in a work of art, as there is in every human being. In art, reality must be given the chance to be mysterious, and fantasy the chance to be commonplace. The DNA of art is metaphor. That's the genetic cell without which nothing can be mutated by craft into art. Art strives towards the mythic, towards seeing heaven in a grain of sand. Art must be serious about itself. That doesn't mean it can't be funny, but it means it can't be trivial. There has to be an element of pleasure in art, of sensual enjoyment, be it of a combination of sounds, of words, of textures, or in images. Art has to ravish the senses, but not only do that. There has to be a moral sense. There must be passion in art. Passion gives us a sense of life lived more intensely, with more meaning, more joy, more sorrow. We are all under sentence of death, but with a sort of indefinite reprieve, said Victor Hugo. Art reflects, expresses, invokes, and describes the ambiguity of humanity, the infinite messiness of it. Art doesn't improve our behavior or civilize us. Art is useless. It doesn't clothe the poor or feed the hungry. It's just as useless as life. But it's precisely our aware of the uselessness of life that makes us want to struggle to give it purpose, and to give that purpose meaning through art. Art is a way of drawing us into a heightened awareness of other people's feelings and other people's lives. It enables us to put ourselves in the minds, ears, eyes, and hearts of other human beings. Any government has a hard job justifying expenditure on the arts. Subsidizing weapons of destruction is easier than subsidizing weapons of happiness. The benefits are hard to quantify, and it's awkward but necessary to recognize that failure is an essential part of artistic creation. Bad art will always exist besides the good. But it seems no more than logic to acknowledge that the corollary of investing taxpayers' money in the arts must be to evolve a strategy that embraces both the departments of culture and of education to invest in the performances and the audiences of the future. It will enfranchise the victims of apartheid.
Thank you, that's great. We're going to turn to some questions in a few minutes, but I thought maybe you could just give us an idea of projects upcoming. Since you left the National Theatre, you've continued to direct plays in all kinds of places. You've done a magnificent Ibsen's Ghosts, which is now on DVD and won a lot of awards. Ibsen seems to fascinate you. I know that's been one of the projects. Also, music, not just musicals, but also opera has also become an area that you've specialized in.
Yes, if you had told me 30 years ago that I would have spent a year, as I did last year, and at the beginning of the year putting my Ibsen production in the Ghosts in the West End, and then I did 3 operas, new operas, and a revival. I mean, 3 new productions. I did Werther, Massenet's Werther, The Marriage of Figaro, and a revival of Carmen at the Met in New York. And I did Manon Lescaut, Puccini's Manon Lescaut, with Simon Rattle and the Berlin Philharmonic in Baden-Baden, in Germany. And if you told me I was going to do that and be preoccupied with Ibsen, I just had nonsense, because I shamefully underestimated Ibsen, and I'm now obsessed with Ibsen, and I've just finished an adaptation of another Ibsen play. I've done 2. I've done Hedda Gabler and Ghosts, and I'm now just finished doing Little Eyolf, which is a play that blows the lid off, the top of your head. It's just extraordinary, and he has this ability to concentrate the most ferociously intense emotions into a very, very small and distilled landscape, and it's quite remarkable. I hope to do that next year, but this year I'm in pre-production at the moment for a film for television of The Dresser, Ronald Harwood's play The Dresser. And this is with Anthony Hopkins as the old actor and Ian McKellen as the dresser. And so that we start filming in 4 or 5 weeks. Then I go to New York to do Ghosts, to put Ghosts on the Brooklyn Academy of Music. And then do a play in the West End called Mr. Foot's Other Leg, which is based on a wonderful history of an 18th century actor called Samuel Foote, who was contemporary and great rival of Garrick. And the play is about everything. It's wonderful. Simon Russell Beale is playing Mr. Foote.
That's great. What do you do to relax?
What do I do to
relax? Do you have a garden? Do you have a garden?
Yes, gardening.
Really?
Actually, yeah, gardening. I could just sort of end with. I wrote about gardening. And
about everything in there. Yeah.
This was from the Sunday Telegraph. And this, I describe how I used to hate gardening and now how I love it. We've got it bad, garden sickness. I was in New York a week ago and found myself thinking about my irises, and I felt a lover's pain of longing. A year or two, our daughter caught Sue talking to the lilac. "You're out," she said. "Mum, I think she knows," said Lucy with weary bemusement. On his deathbed, the novelist John Steinbeck was asked by his wife when he'd been happiness. "Write it down," he said. Both wrote down the same thing, Somerset Contentment, 1959. If Sue and I did the same thing, we might write Gloucestershire Garden, 1994. There's a large, about 12-foot tall bay tree which stands in a herb garden outside our kitchen. It was a small, neat shrub when it was given to us for our wedding nearly 40 years ago by an ex-girlfriend of mine. A bay tree tells you the state of your marriage. If it flourishes, so will you, she said. I grew up in the country, in a then unspoilt part of England, indifferent to the coming of spring and the miraculous greenness of green. Now, in my early 60s, I understand what Dennis Potter felt when Melvyn Bragg asked him in a TV interview a few weeks before his death what he would miss most. "I won't see another spring," he said. And I'm affected by the intensity of Ranievskaya's Rhapsody to the Spring Blossom in the Cherry Orchard, written by a man who knew all too well that his time was running out. 18 months to go, one more spring. Your garden is a laboratory for studying how your life is spent, counted out in the coming of the changing of the seasons. Shelley, fresh spring and summer and winter hoar move my faint heart with grief, but with delight, no more, oh, never more. I wish I could share my garden with my mother. I'm still not won over by the flowers that she loved, but I wish that I could tell her now that I understand her desire to put her signature on a little patch of earth. In her marvellous history of the British garden, Jenny Huglow writes that the Saxon word for garden is a lovely place. So it is, and so I must go. Il faut cultiver mon jardin.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much. Good. It's an all too brief canter through an absolutely stunning book by, I think, one of our great essayists, if I may say. A lovely quote from Montaigne, of course, the man who really invented the art of essay, and I think it really, really works in your case as well. So thank you, and all the books here. I think we can maybe open the lights, turn up the lights a bit, and would love to get some questions from any of you while you're here. Yes, please. And that's this, yes, Sally Grace.
The first thing I'd like to say is it's simply an observation, but it's very little known that the person who taught Maggie, Thatcher, who talked about her earlier, was in fact an ex-Bootham student.
Oh, really?
Robert Powell, and he was always ashamed of what he did. He did his best, but he never liked listening to it afterwards. The second thing I'd like to say is, many years ago, I was fortunate enough to make a film with you. I was the unnecessary dialect coach. You don't recognize me because I was invisible, as I should be. In a film that you made called A Complete Stage Beauty.
Oh,
Indeed.
My view, which was not objective, was a much better film about female actors of the time
yes.
than the other one.
Shakespeare in Love.
Yes.
And your film didn't get the recognition that I thought it deserved. It also, at that time, I used to get mail saying complete stage beauty, stepped, because it was misspelt. And it's bothered me ever since. I wondered why, two double questions here, why the complete was deleted, and what your view of that film was.
Well, this is a film that ended up being called Stage Beauty, and it was set at the moment when actresses, Charles II, allowed women to go on stage, and it was about that moment, and it was about a love story between an actor who was a hugely successful female impersonator and who was then made redundant, and his dresser, played by the unknown Claire Danes, and Billy Crudup, who was the actor. The original script was called Complete Female Stage Beauty, complete spelt with 17th century spelling. And since it ended up financed largely by the Americans, the complete bit went out of the window. And it also suffered from not being very well marketed in the States, and also that immediately it came out, it had wonderful advance publicity, and then it came out and people said, oh no, we've seen that, it's called Shakespeare in Love. So, well, anyway, thank you. I can't really
Sally Grace.
see you, Sally, but
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, good. Very good. Can we have another question? Yes, go ahead.
I very much enjoyed your talk. I really love your voice. How can we make sure that drama is not just accessed by people from a particular social class?
Well, I think that's at the heart. Is it possible to have a bit more light in the auditorium, or is that it? Because it's so hard to see.
Can we bring up
see
the
people.
lights? Yeah.
The what?
Yeah, yeah. They'll probably try to tend to that.
I think that's the heart of the problem, and that's why I talk about cultural apartheid. I mean, in a way, I experienced something similar, although I came from a quite privileged background. My father was a farmer. I grew up in Dorset, which at the time was, would have been celebrated or mourned for the fact that there were no theatres, art galleries, concert halls. So, and my parents weren't interested in the arts. So I never actually went to the theatre. I was nearly 16 before I saw a proper play. And the first play I saw was a play called Hamlet with Peter O'Toole, and it was at the Bristol Old Vic. And it just, it blew my mind. I thought it was, I thought the theatre it was just sensational, and that was the catalyst. That was what made me interested in theatre. And unless you get that experience, I mean, you have to, in order to understand what the attraction is of theatre, you have to experience it. So if school children don't get the opportunity to go to the theatre, where are they going to get it? Because it's not the same when you see a sort of digital version, you know, and you watch it in a cinema. It's two-dimensional. And
How can we identify all that talent? Particularly if you have the angry young men. Where is all that talent? Where is it?
oh, there's a lot of, I think
Where is it? Where's it going?
there's a lot of talent, writing talent around, and directing and acting talent. It's just what I worry about more is that I mean, you may have seen this recent row between James Blunt and the Shadow Secretary of State. And it is true that, so my generation you could get a grant to go to a drama school, and you could get a grant to go to art school, and it was, you know, we were so lucky, our generation. And so the class base of my generation of actors is very, very different. Now, you know, it is sort of bizarre that we do have, whatever, 8 Etonians in the cabinet, but also that the 2 British male Oscar nominees, one went to Eton and one went to Harrow. And they're both brilliant actors, it should be said. But it's got to, you know, that's why if the government were interested, then they would have a view about how to emancipate the arts instead of, you know, making it further and further a sort of minority concern and a very sort of privileged concern.
Yeah. There is no easy answer, and obviously the arguments we have with education. I'm sorry.
Ricky.
Come down from Edinburgh, and I would like you to tell people what happened to you as a man of theatre in your Edinburgh years. As maybe one question, what did you learn from being the deputy director of the Lyceum Theatre? And the second question is, in Edinburgh, at a certain Edinburgh festival in 1972, you saw for yourself, you experienced for yourself the genius of someone called Judy Dench. And as a theatre critic, of course your many roles, you dare to say that if anyone had written the language of contemporary avant-garde theatre, it was this man, Cantor. Can you just go back to that period? You were so ridiculously young.
Well, I was young. The speaker is is a fellow of your college, but also a brilliant gallery owner and curator, and Richard DeMarco, who was one of the glories of Edinburgh. When I first went to live in Edinburgh in 1967, Ricky's gallery was a sort of lighthouse of creativity, and through him I saw some of the great work of 20th century artists, including Joseph Beuys, the German sculptor, whose work can be seen at Tate Modern. And the man who Ricky mentions is Cantor. Tadeusz Cantor was a Polish theatre maker who really anticipated the work of Pina Bausch and Théâtre de Complicité, and he had this company, and he appeared, and he somehow conducted the performance from within it, and it told a story which was in Polish, and it was partly in mime, it was partly in speech. One didn't understand it, but you could see perfectly, and it was like seeing a sort of Hieronymus Bosch painting brought to life. Extraordinary work, and this is 1972, and I think, I mean, one of the things I like about the theatre is it's so ephemeral. You know, if you're not there, it's gone. But one of the things I regret is that the history of theatre never pays homage to, you know, those great innovators. It just, you know, it's as if it's all been invented yesterday. But he was a great performer, and I was a quite young director who was given this fantastic job by the guy who was running the Lyceum Theatre, which was a 750-seat, beautiful Victorian theatre in Edinburgh, to just do play after play after play after play. And I just can't believe my luck. And it was a very, very exciting time to be in Edinburgh, because the Travis Theatre was full of life, and there just seemed so much optimism in the air. And I always feel now that, and the Edinburgh Festival was so alive. Now it's sort of corporatized. But it was a thrilling period, and during one of the festivals, I was asked by the Scotsman if I would review theatre, and that was one of the shows I reviewed. I reviewed another show, which was a review from a song and dance thing from Bristol University, and it was absolutely terrible, and I wrote a scorchingly bad review, and they found out where I lived and threw stones at my window and shouted. So I didn't go back to criticism too much after that.
Lovely. Yes, over here. There we are, yes.
I'm just thinking about the Polish influence on theatre, and I'm interested in Cantor and Grotowski. And I was reading an article today where Grotowski was a disciple of Stanislavski initially. Sort of finding it extraordinary that we have rehearsal periods of no more than 4, 5, 6 weeks, and he wouldn't dream of attempting anything that was less than a sort of 3-year rehearsal. Would you have liked 3 years to rehearse a play, or do you
Actually, I wouldn't. I used to go a lot to Romania before during the Ceausescu days, and so I saw sort of state theatre in its sort of purest form. And what was fascinating was how, of course, all the challenging theatre was allegorical. Nothing could be said directly. So the theatre was an extraordinarily potent medium, and people would read the signs of dissent. And they used to rehearse, kind of 3-4 months. And I used to go to rehearsals, and there was sort of torpor over rehearsal, and they'd only do a couple of hours a day. And people had guaranteed, you know, lives. They were in the company. Once you joined the company, you had this guarantee of employment for life. And I don't like that. I really do like the sort of, part of what I like about the theatre is the sort of gypsy life. I like the fact that, you know, you're on your mettle, you're kind of as good as your last job. And I'm not convinced that, you know, permanent companies produce, you know, the stuff about, you know, the majestic work in depth. I've seen terrible productions from the Moscow Art Theatre. Terrible, where everything's sort of ossified and there's no kind of energy there. Equally, I've seen some remarkable stuff from companies that have been together a long time, but they sort of come together and then break up, and come together and break up. I like the sort of pragmatic nature of the theatre in this country that there's a sort of de facto company, because what happens is you get together a group of actors, you can absolutely guarantee that 2/3 of them will have worked with each other in some sort of context. And, you know, there aren't that many. I know there are supposed to be 20,000 members of Equity, but sort of working members of Equity who do theatre, it's quite a small number, and it's a sort of community, and it is a sort of de facto company.
Yeah.
But,
Got a
yeah.
question from someone here. Yes, please.
Your production of Guys and Dolls was voted the most popular thing that the National Theatre ever did. And I think the word life enhancing was used about it quite frequently, which I think was quite right. But was there anything during your tenure that you regret not having done? It was hugely successful, but were there things you don't?
Yes, there were, but I've sort of suppressed all that. There are so many things that I wish I'd done differently and better. I wish I knew at the end what I didn't know at the beginning. I mean, I wish I knew at the beginning what I knew at the end. Last year, there was a book that is about as thick as the King James Bible, a history of the National Theatre. And they sent me the chapters on my period, and I had to sort of read them like that. I found it so extraordinarily painful to kind of go through, and this didn't work, and Eyre did so-and-so, and I thought, what must it be like for politicians who are endlessly having to, I know he deserves it, but what is it like for Tony Blair to never be able to pick up a newspaper without being excoriated for the Iraq War? And you just... So the answer to your question is yes, there were many things I wish I'd done, and playwrights and things that I wish I'd directed, and things that I wish I hadn't directed. But the great thing about theatre is that you move on. It's always, theatre is castigated for its sentimentality. People say, it's all that lovey world. It's terribly unsentimental. If you've ever seen the dock door of a theatre after the end of a long-running play, and then the set is just being chucked out and broken up and put into a skip, costumes are sent away to be used for some other show, and the actors, you're very emotional at the time, and then you're on to the next thing, and you don't hanker after the past. You really don't. It's the next piece of work. Because if you stop and say, wasn't it? Well, those were the days, then you shouldn't be working in the theatre. It's just, the theatre exists in the present tense. That's the indissoluble nature of it. In the same way as you can't make abstract theatre. Theatre exists in the present tense, in the presence of live people, live performers. That's what... So I'm sorry, I haven't answered your question. I've completely evaded it.
Yes, you had a question, please.
Hello. I wanted to ask your opinion of the state of London Fringe Theatre, and where you think its future lies, and whether you get a chance to be involved with it at all.
It sort of depends what you mean by fringe. The sort of, what used to be the fringe meant, outside the West End. And it's now, you've got the Donmar, you've got the Finborough Theatre, you've got Hampstead Theatre, you've got the Almeida, Arcola, all those flourishing theatres. I don't know if you call those fringe, because they're I don't think they are fringe. They're sort of outside the West End, but the West End is virtually no new shows are done in the West End. They're all done somewhere else and brought to the West End. I mean, I think it's incredibly healthy. And I think what's healthy is so many new young writers are writing for theatre because they can actually say what they want to say rather than writing for television and being, on the whole, shoehorned into some particular format. And so I'm very, very optimistic about theatre. And the example I always quote is that when I was the best new play that landed on my desk when I was running the National Theatre was sent to me by a friend of mine who ran a theatre in California. And it was a play called Angels in America, two-part play by Tony Kushner, who I think was the best writer of the 1990s. At that time, if you'd asked me the morning before that play appeared on my desk what I thought of new writing in America, I'd have said, well, it's dead. You know, there's virtually no new writing. You know, go off Broadway, it's very, very conventional stuff. And then this astonishing play appeared, which is revolutionary in content and in form and about, you know, Marxism and about Mormonism and about death and AIDS and sexuality and sort of everything, and astonishing piece of work. And somehow then it's like sunspots. They can't be predicted. For all we know about the sun and our universe, sunspots come without warning. And suddenly they're saying, oh, there's a big sunspot, and that's what's affecting the weather. And since Tony's work, it's encouraged a lot of really brilliant
Open
new
things
writing.
up, open it up and form up. And,
so I think I hate it when there used to be a rash of journalistic crap about, you know, the theatre is dead, and then it was the novel is dead, and then, you know, the pop song is dead, and jazz is dead, and painting is dead, and, you know, it's just journalism. And then, you know, it's almost like encouraged the moment that somebody writes and painting is dead, someone emerges and you think, oh, painting's dead, is it? Here's this remarkable painter that emerges, and people, you know, use all the available mediums. It's only journalists who believe that, you know, things, because they're so worried about newspapers, which maybe are dead, but...
Listen, you guys, we kept our backs to you, so I apologize for that. Have you got something? Yes. Yeah, right? Okay, good, go.
Speaking as an American, I think tendencies are for the arts to be clumped into this esoteric sense that we belong in an intellectual left, where we have plenty of great ideas, but we could not win a midterm election if our life depended on it. And so what can we actually do in the arts that affects political change, that inherently brings back funding into the arts? What have you seen in your career that has actually changed, that's pragmatic and tangible that we can do?
Well, that's an extremely difficult question to answer. What I would say is that the poet W.B. Yeats said in a poem, W.H. Auden said in a poem called In Memory of W.B. Yeats, said, poetry doesn't make things happen. But people quote that as if saying, well, the arts are no use. He qualifies the remark by saying, but it survives in the valley of its own making where the executive can't tamper with it. It survives as a piece of happiness. I'm sorry, I've lost the quote. I mean, essentially, he's saying it survives as a voice. It's part of what I describe as the archipelago of dissent, of what I say the I in society rather than the we. So the more the arts spread, and I don't think it's always dependent on public subsidy. It's dependent on having an open heart, being able to accept what the arts are saying, because basically what the arts are doing, I mean, every art is really just trying to say about other people, here is what the other person thinks. Here is how the other person sees. So it's, you know, the only sort of religious injunction that really moves me is the injunction to love thy neighbor as thyself. And I think that's, you can't love anybody unless you can empathize with them. And you can't empathize with them unless you understand what they're thinking. And this is what I think the arts are able to do. They're able to take you into somebody else's head, somebody else's world, and that doesn't answer the question of how you practically change things, and you change things just by doing, by pieces of work like Tony Kushner's play that gets performed and gradually widens people's conception of how the world works. But I can't give you a sort of practical remedy of how you go out and organize change. And I'm slightly wary of these, you know, petitions which now come every single day. And I guess, you know, you know the petitions that appear on, you get emails saying, could you sign this petition? And, you know, half of them you think, yeah, of course I can. And half of them you think, no, why? Because I'm not going to waste my efforts on this. I want to change something else. But it's incredibly difficult. I really think it's
Well, we
incredibly
can't forget that when you were at the National Theatre and did plays like Pravda, the David Hare trilogy, the National Theatre became a voice for public dissent, public debate, which of course is the great power of theatre, is to be a place of debate. And those plays were widely reported on, widely seen. Did a lot of consciousness raising, a lot of change came out of that, I do think. I suppose there had to have been conscious effort on your part that the role of artistic director, the head of the National Theatre, was also a political role.
Well, it is
kind of a party unto itself, in a way.
At the time I was appointed, it was a political appointment. And the board were appointed by Downing Street. And in fact, there was a lot of fuss because when Mary Soames, who was Churchill's youngest daughter, was appointed as chair of the National Theatre Board, she was appointed, in fact, as somebody later told me, somebody in the Tory party, she was appointed specifically because they wanted a right-wing chair in order to sort out the pinkos at the National Theatre, meaning me. Actually, they completely failed because Mary went native and she fell in love with the National Theatre and she was intensely loyal and she was a fantastic asset because she would brook no criticism at all from any politician of the National Theatre. So they were a bit, the Tory party of the time were a bit bemused by the fact that there was this, Mary Soames, who is icon of this Churchill's daughter of the Tory party, had actually, become a turncoat.
Did she like sitting down with you and having lunch with actors?
She absolutely loved it. And she was brilliant. She knew every department of the National Theatre. She did exactly what a chair should do, embraced the whole thing, became its champion, and critic, you know, in private, she could be very beady. She had a wonderful instinct, although, as she said when she was appointed, she said, Richard, I know absolutely nothing about theatre, so you're going to have to teach me. And she had a sort of perfect nose for the bogus. And she could sniff out fakery. I had the fantastic honour the other day. She died in May of last year, and her memorial service was at Westminster Abbey in November, and I spoke about her from the pulpit of Westminster Abbey. It's a bit of a one-off, that. And it was fantastic with, you know, the whole choir of Westminster Abbey and the trumpeters and the organ, and she would have loved it.
And that's in the book too.
That is in the
That's
book,
in
yeah.
too. Listen, we're going to end the formal part of this here, so thank you very much to Richard Eyre.
Thank you very much.
And we're going to be out in the lobby. There's